I am so honored to have Neil Smith on my podcast, on our podcast. He needs no introduction, but if there were one line that at least sports fans would know is that he's the general manager who brought the New York Rangers a Stanley Cup, won in 84 years, and did it in such a fascinating way, which we'll get into in a little bit. But Neil is also just a fantastic leader. He's identified some of the great talents in the NHL that, unless you're a real knowledgeable hockey fan, you wouldn't appreciate. That he found these Hall of Famers when he was a scout, captain of his college hockey team as a sophomore. Also leads by example in the mental health space, talking about a tragedy that we'll get into as well. But Neil, I'm so excited to have you on the show. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Bill Neal, our mutual friend, who introduced us and made this happen. So, Neil, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. And, I owe Bill a ton of gratitude and thanks for changing my life back when I was 20 years old. And he had a big impact in my life, and we had 4 great years together, and then we stayed friends for the next 46. So that's a pretty good run.
It's a pretty good run. 50-year friendships are hard to find, and he's a wonderful human being, and I was lucky enough to have him on and went through all the interesting path that he's taken. But I do want to start with your transition from being a wonderful college player, drafted in the NHL, and then making the transition to get into scouting. What was that like, kind of flipping the camera a bit from playing the game, understanding the game at a very high level, but then having to look at it and look at other people's talent and figuring out how they would fit in?
Well, the longer version of that answer, which I'm glad to give you, and I haven't really given to many people all these years, is that when I was 17 years old, I met a man named Jim Devellano, and I met him at summer hockey, and he was a scout for the St. Louis Blues. We became friends, and shortly thereafter, he became a scout for the brand new New York Islanders. And I went to lots of games with him and saw what scouts do and all this. And this is long before Western Michigan. So it was a little bit, I wanted to be an NHL player, of course, like everybody does. So I went on to play junior and then play college. And then I got out of college and tried to make my way in pro hockey, not very well, and played 2 years in the Mars. But I had it, it was almost in my DNA to know how to scout and to know what to do, because I had been seeing it for a number of years with my friend. So I had an idea one day. I was in New York, working in the garment district, believe it or not. And I had this thing that I wanted to be back in hockey. I missed it so much. I couldn't go back to playing. It was just it was crazy because it would just roadblock any career that I was really trying to get into. So I said to Jim Devellano, who was working for the Islanders, is there anything I can do for the Islanders? Anything? Because I said, I really want to get out of what I'm doing and go back to hockey. I said, I could just go to the Rangers games at Madison Square Garden and watch the Rangers and the opponents and give you guys a report. And I said, I'm good at systems. And the systems came because of Bill, and Bill was good at systems. And so he said, well, let me ask Al Arbor about that. And so all of a sudden, I'm with this great Al Arbor. I'm shaking in my boots. He's meeting me at a Burger King on Long Island and giving me these forms to fill out. So I started doing that for him. That was the 80-81 season. I went to as many games as I could. He started sending me all over the place. And I was working for free, by the way. I wasn't getting paid. I got expense money. They win the Stanley Cup against Minnesota in 1981. And I go to Bill Torrey and I said, can I be back as full time? And he said, yeah, I can pay you $10,000, which is what I was getting the year before from the garment district. So I said, great. He could have said 10,000 yen. I would have taken it because I wanted to be in the NHL. So I went to 150 NHL games that year. I remember that very clearly. Like I'd hit 2 on some days because I could hit an afternoon game and a night game. And I'd give all the reports to Al Arbor and about all the different teams. And I mostly would go to see teams that the Islanders were about to play. And that year was 81, 82. The Islanders win the Stanley Cup again against Vancouver that year. And Jimmy Delano gets a call from the Illiches, who had just bought the Detroit Red Wings, and they hire him as the general manager. And he turns and, well, he can take his protege with him, me, and I go to Detroit and started scouting in Detroit. And then I had 7 years with Detroit, making my way up the ladder in with the Red Wings, becoming chief scout by the end. And as I said, it was sort of in me to know, to recognize talent. The other thing, to finish this answer, is that I've always been detail oriented. In other words, I notice details that other people probably don't pay attention to. So it can be really annoying at times. Like if you're driving on the highway and I see that, oh, they changed that billboard, and people in the car will go, well, what? What? No, that billboard, it used to say Shell and now it is Texaco, or something like that. And so that helps you with scouting, because you notice little idiosyncrasies about the players that others might not catch on to. So yeah, it was sort of a natural thing for me to go into scouting.
Well, one of the things I observed in doing research for this and talking to our mutual friend about you is also you've got an incredible EQ, and you get information from people, I think, because this is my projection onto you. You tell me if I'm right or wrong, because you're easy to talk to. So people share information with you. Talk about, I mean, you kind of gave me a frustrating early ride, because I'm an opening day season ticket holder of the Dallas Stars, and you were responsible for creating the Red Army that would beat up on my Stars all the time, although we had some good matchups back in the day. But talk about, you found these players, Lidstrom, Fedorov, and others who were game changers, and you got them when they were very young. How did tell that story? Because I think whatever industry people are in who are listening to this, I think the way you spotted the talent and made the calculus is so interesting.
Well, I think the reason that I was able to do this is because I was very young as compared to the other scouts in the NHL. And I always have thought outside the box on everything. And so when this opportunity came for me to go to Europe and scout in Sweden and Finland and Czechoslovakia, Russia, I jumped on it because I wanted to do that. I enjoyed seeing new things, and I was still young, so I didn't care. And going behind the Iron Curtain scared you, but I'm young. The guys that are older, they're married and have grown kids. They don't want to do that stuff.
It's risky.
So yeah, and to be quite honest, it wasn't pleasant. You weren't going to a Holiday Inn over there. You were going to other things much less than that. So I really enjoyed that. And the other thing, Craig, that has really helped me, maybe because I grew up with all women. My father died when I was 10. My mother was a hockey player in her younger days, like a real good hockey player. And my grandmother, her mother, lived with us, and I have an older sister. And I know I'm a very good listener. And the reason I'm a very good listener is because I know that I will learn things if I will listen. And I told people I never learned anything while I was talking. I could only learn by listening. So you're right in that I like talking to people. I like finding out information. I like finding out thoughts of other people, opinions of other people. And so that really lends well to drafting hockey players and finding out things about the hockey player and his background and his life and his living habits and how he thinks. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't like with Nicholas Lidstrom, who won 7 Norris trophies for the best defenseman in the league and ended up being the first European captain to win the Stanley Cup and was on all 4 Red Wing Cup teams. I had a scout that I really believed in that I found in Sweden. His name's Christer Rockstrom. And I found him driving a cab. He picked me up one day and we started talking hockey. He didn't speak English very well, but he knew every young player in Sweden. And so I went back to Jimmy and I said, we got to hire this guy and make him our scout. So it ended up that by the time we were down the road there in 88, 89 season when he called me and he says, I think you really need to come and see this young kid that's playing in Vasteros. And he described what was going on. And he wasn't getting any playing time with the elite team because he was a young guy and the coach just was playing the older guys all the time. So I ended up watching him and then I ended up taking him out for dinner. I remember it was Pizza Hut. And he was an intelligent kid and all of this. And then I begged Jimmy, who was more of a Canadian Hockey League guy than a European guy. I said, please, we got to take this Lidstrom kid in the third round. We have to take him in the third round because after the third round, you couldn't take 18-year-olds. So he would have gone in the first round the next year. And I knew that. So it was stuff like that, that you listen, you believe in people, and then you make your decision.
Yeah. And you're looking for, as you say, no one would care about the billboard, but the billboard change sometimes suggests something else, and so, the character of somebody, and I know that we all have players that surprise us with an addiction issue or something else, but I love the way you look for character. And what, you know, early on, the Russian player, what was the risk that a Fedorov might leave?
Here's the thing. There was a couple of Russians that had been given permission to leave that had played for Red Army, and they went to the Devils. And so I thought it was a matter of time until these guys were allowed to come out. But what I said about them to my organization was, if we have to wait, you can't get a player of this quality here. You can't. Like, these guys are way above what we're talking about, the best players in Russia, and Russia's a huge country and hockey is a dominant sport. So you're talking about elite players. And, if we have to wait on them, well, they're still going to be fantastic players. So it was that, and the notion too that I thought that the world had to open up sooner or later. It had to. It couldn't forever imprison its citizens, which is what the communist system did. So eventually the wall came down, and we got all this great talent.
What did the Red Wings do to provide scaffolding, and what did you guys do with the Rangers and the Islanders and the other organizations you worked with to help these guys transition, these kids transition into a foreign country?
Just as a matter of fact, when we won the Stanley Cup in 1994, now remember, I went to the Rangers in 89-90. So when we won the Cup in 94, we put the first 4 Russian names on the Stanley Cup ever. Had never been a Russian on the Stanley Cup. So to put it in a time perspective, that's when they started to come into their own. Now, when I brought guys over, the first Russian player that I brought to the Rangers was Sergei Nemchinov. And Sergei was an older player in his mid-20s to mid to late 20s. And he was a very quality guy. I had met him. And when we brought Sergei Zubov, your guy.
One of my favorite guys ever. I love Sergei Zubov.
Sergei Zubov, when we brought him and brought Alex Kovalev over, we had Nemchinov there to mentor them. So he was a great mentor. In the early days of bringing Russians and Czech players over, they had to get used to freedoms that they were given and the things that they were given. It's one thing for you to go from Canada to the United States. Suddenly you're in the NHL and you're being treated like you're a king. But you can imagine going from what we all lower class status to all of a sudden you're in high upper class in the States. You can imagine the transition is very tough for them. And put on top of it the language barrier and having to learn the language. So naturally you get them tutors. That goes without saying. And nowadays they have nutritionists with the teams that adapt things. But it was important that both in Detroit and in New York that we had other Russian influence there, so that there was a deeper understanding of the psyche of a Russian or a Czech player.
Yeah. And was there a way that the Eastern European players would integrate with the more English speaking Canadian American players? Like, how did you kind of force that camaraderie, if you will?
Well, it's funny, Craig. Hockey players are hockey players, and that's an international language. And so, you see players even today that play in the NHL that can barely speak the language, and yet they they can they speak hockey language to each other. In that this is not football where all the plays are set plays. Hockey is a game of instincts and quick things happening. And so I think that once you get into a locker room and you're used to being on teams because you've been doing this your whole life and you're sitting around with 18, 19, 20 other guys, it goes naturally for you, and of course, hockey players want to play with other good hockey players. It's you even in adult hockey, when you go out there and play now, it's much more fun to play with guys who know how to play than to play with pickup players who really never played at any level. And it's the same in the NHL.
Makes sense. So, as a huge sports fan, I always wonder what's the tipping point for a general manager to go for it, if you will. And the '94 Rangers were the example of going for it. I remember watching the run, and I was rooting for you guys. I don't know why. I wasn't a Rangers fan really, but it just you had Messi and Gretzky back together. Um, Talk about the calculus of putting that super team together, if you will. What were the constraints, in dealing with ownership and fitting those pieces into the broader puzzle, and then how the coach Mike Keenan fit into that whole equation.
Well, the building towards the Stanley Cup or the absolute goal of winning the cup. Your goal should always be to win the cup, but the absolute knowing where I was with this Ranger organization and trying to put it on fast forward was in 1991 when I was able to trade for Messier. Now, the truth be known, I was fortunate at that particular time. The Oilers were having financial problems. They couldn't pay the money that the American teams could pay. When Glenn Sather, the GM of the Oilers, was calling around about Messier because he wanted to get as much, he wanted to trade him because they couldn't pay him. Everybody thought that he was trying to put one over on them with an injured player because Mark had played so much. Believe it or not, it sounds funny to say it, I was taking a chance because I didn't know if I was getting damaged goods or not, other than the physical that we had the night before he came to New York. So, but getting him and getting Adam Graves that summer and getting Jeff Boom from the Oilers was the start of a really good team. I already had Richter and Leach. They were before I got there. Ricky was in the minors. Brian Leach had just won the Calder Trophy. And so getting this horse up front in Messier, you can imagine Richter, as it turns out, ended up being a franchise goaltender. Obviously, Leach was a franchise a defenseman, and now you had a franchise center in Messier. And I also had Adam Graves, who I drafted for Detroit, so I sort of stole him from Edmonton. And in 1992, and Roger Nielsen was the coach, we came very close. In fact, we were up on the Pittsburgh Penguins 3-2. We ended up losing that series, and Pittsburgh never lost another game. They swept the next two series on to their second straight Stanley Cup. And we had Pittsburgh on the ropes that year, so we could have won the cup in 92. So we had the makings of a contending team there. We'd won the President's Trophy, which is first place overall. And then in 93, we had a lot of injuries. We had a lot of bad things happen. I had to let Roger Nielsen go. We brought Ron Smith up from the minor league team. That didn't work. We still missed the playoffs. I traded for Kevin Lowe and Eddie Olchuk and others. Still missed the playoffs. And I said to our executives and owners, we've got to get a coach that can handle this level of player that we now have. We don't, these are not these are star players that we've got on this team and guys that are used to winning. And we're going to have to get a coach that's like that. And I said, the three that I know of are Scotty Bowman, but he's coaching Pittsburgh, Al Arbor, but he's coaching the Islanders, and Mike Keenan. And he's available because he just got fired by Chicago as their GM. So, I knew Mike and actually got along with Mike in as a fellow GM. And then, but I'd also heard the stories. And I said, I can deal with anybody. It goes back to our conversation about, being able to talk to anybody and having this confidence that you can work with anybody. I can work with the devil. I just can't. And so we hired Mike Keenan, and that 93-94 season, obviously Mike pushed all the right buttons. I mean, there were a lot of buttons I didn't like him pushing because I just thought it was unfair. It was not my style. There was, he thought everybody in Chicago was great, better than everything I had in New York. He was very hard for a GM to work with. His whole career, he was very hard for a GM wherever he went. And the stories, of course, are famous for what you got to deal with Mike Keenan. But I think the fact that he is a guy who coached with chaos, so he created a chaotic environment around him wherever he went. He created a chaotic environment that he knew how to deal with. But the rest of us who don't like chaos don't know how to deal in a chaotic environment. So this made it for him that he could, steer his way through that. And I think it kept the players off balance. So I think it did exactly what we'd hoped, which was it kept those stars, those superstars, and everybody wondering what's coming next. They didn't know when they showed up at the arena what they were going to get that day. And I think that kept them off balance and bonded them together as players with one common denominator. They all thought the coach was or their best friend. That's right. So, it helped in many ways, and it obviously was the right coach because we ended up winning. There were times when I didn't think we were going to because of said coach, but it all ended up good. And and thankfully it changed all of our lives for the better.
I don't care who you root for in sports. You always, if you were alive and a hockey fan, you remember the team that you hoisted the trophy for. So it's amazing to just talk about it with you. How does a Gretzky deal with somebody like? I mean, when somebody has hit the pinnacle of the sport, does he just kind of sit on the side and laugh and let it go over? How talk about the dynamic of Wayne Gretzky as a hockey player and how he deals with a coach who doesn't, I don't know, maybe even know as much about the game as Gretzky does. Like, how did that all work?
Well, it's interesting, and I'm blessed to have been able to sign Wayne Gretzky, and probably, other than the Stanley Cup, is my most proudest moment, giving New York Wayne Gretzky, or being able to give New York Wayne Gretzky, because, I never thought I'd see a 99 on the back of a Ranger jersey. But Wayne is in that category with LeBron James, and I like to use these names, and not all from hockey, the Michael Jackson and Elton John and Reggie Jackson from the Yankee days of 3 home runs in the 3 different pitchers at Yankee Stadium. He's that iconic. He's up there with the icons of entertainment. I was lucky to see him a lot play when he was so dominant in Edmonton that I actually wrote a report to say this isn't fair, because every time he's on the ice, it's a scoring chance every single time. But he was also a typical Canadian kid that wanted to talk hockey all the time, enjoyed talking hockey, and enjoyed being one of the guys, just one of the guys, and going on the road trips and playing the games and being in the hotels and doing all the stuff that hockey players do. He still was that guy. but of course he was Wayne Gretzky. And, you ask non-hockey fans, people who say, "Oh, I don't follow hockey. I don't know anything about hockey." And you say, "Can you name one player?" And they go, "Well, I only know that Gretzky guy." That's how they do it. So, there wasn't a lot of difference or magic there as far as who he was as the person. He was one of the guys, and I think his life is harder now because he's Wayne Gretzky in normal life, in we call normal life, because he knew how to play the role of Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player. He'd been doing it since he was 5 years old, and being Wayne Gretzky, the iconic hockey player that was the best of the best of the best. I think it would be harder to be Wayne Gretzky, the ex-hockey player who was the best of the best of the best. How do you handle life now, going forward for another 45 years? And knowing that you're still going to get that everywhere you go, people are going to be talking that, oh, Wayne Gretzky's in here, and all those things that go with being that famous. But you don't have your hockey to go back to. You don't have your locker room to go back to. You don't have your thing that you do to go back to. So I think that's tough on all of us when our careers end. At whatever we're doing, we have to transition into not being able to call ourselves the lawyer, the general manager, the nurse, the doctor, and you just go to being Dave, Bob, Bill, or whoever. And I think it's a very tough identity issue, especially for men when their career ends.
Well, having listened to a number of podcasts you've been on, and I watch Gretzky, obviously, when the Stars are in the playoffs, especially commentating. I mean, you guys share a humility which reflects a detachment from the ego piece. To me, that separates these guys who leave their big fancy titles and jobs from the people who never kind of get over it and have to just live in the past. As you and I discussed, I'll be 60 in a few days, and we all hit these milestones when we think about, well, how do we identify ourselves, right? And I never got to hoist the Stanley Cup. I always wanted to be a GM. I wanted to be a baseball general manager. So I'm jealous of that. But we have to define ourselves by being good people. The rest is formed from somebody who is an expert at identifying talent in hockey. What is it about Gretzky? I mean, sports, basketball, they're measurables. Gretzky didn't have necessarily, I know he was a great skater, but outside of the measurables, what was it about Gretzky?
Wayne had, and I'm sure still has, an instinct within that, 200 by 85 foot surface, an instinct of where to be able to get the puck and be able to do what he had to do with it and have the time to be able to do that. And he was on my podcast. Again, I was very lucky.
Your inaugural one, right? The first one of the series.
The inaugural one. I was lucky to get him to be the inaugural one. And he said something on that podcast. And this was the beginning of us wanting every podcast to give you something that you didn't know before you listened. And what he said, I didn't know. And that was that his coach said to him, I want you to sit and watch Bobby Clark carefully on TV and watch where he goes. Watch where Bobby Clark goes on the ice. And he said, and Wayne said, that's how I developed that ability to get away from everybody, because he said, at my size, if I went in front of the net, they would have killed me. So he says, I learned to go behind the net and go to other places where they couldn't get to me. And so it was those instincts that he had to go to those places where other people don't think to go. It's a very hard thing to describe, but he had those instincts to be able to do that. And create great offensive things. I mean, even in his last couple of years when he was with the Rangers, I saw him do things that were just amazing. I mean, everybody remembers in the 97 playoffs, him getting a hat trick against Florida at Madison Square Garden and the way he got it and so on. And that's in his mid 30s and he was still doing it. So, um, just, just, just an amazing guy to watch because he had these great instincts. Now there's others that play today that have similar instincts. They're not the same size as Wayne. The game is played differently than Wayne's day. But Connor McDavid has fantastic instincts on where to go and how to go there. You've got Connor Bedard, the little guy in Chicago, that has tremendous instincts of how he's going to be able to be effective at that small size. And they're sort of elite brains, if you know what I mean. They've got these brains that tell them they've figured it out, how to go to the right places.
Yeah, it's but the Stars, as you know, have a great young nucleus, and this Logan Stankoven has a little bit of what you described. He's 5'5" or 6. I don't know, but he's weaving his way a little bit like St. Louis, or one of those guys. He gets lost, and so he ends up with the puck always in a position to either make a great pass or have a scoring. I love the artistry of hockey. There's no other sport that has that, what you just described. And of course, Gretzky's a business school lesson of don't go straight line to where the puck is, go to where the puck's going to be and put you in a better position. So you described it better than I could, but I'm going to shift a little more serious in terms of, I know you had some instances and you see it all the time in hockey with players who had tragedy. Stevens, I know the story about you grabbing him out of jail, a difficult situation. Some of the players who had substance issues. How does a GM deal with great people and players who are just suffering with addiction, and how do you manage that?
Today's managers have a lot more help than we had, and it's a lot more of a societal issue than it was in the 90s. And the only thing that you can do with, I think, with anybody, hockey players are just the same as everybody else. You got to be compassionate with these people. You have to be compassionate. You have to see it for what it is, and it's a disease. If you're an alcoholic, if you're an abuser, if you are if you've got demons that put you into a rage in your domestic life, there's a disease there, and you got to treat it with compassion and get them the help that they need. And I think you have to put the business of hockey or whatever business you're in, you have to put it off to the side, because if you don't cure that disease that that individual has and you don't get them help, they're not going to be able to help your business. And that goes for an athlete or anything else. So in my mind, I think you just have to be on the scene and be compassionate. Now, the Kevin Stevens story, I'll tell you, because I had never faced anything like that before. So we were in St. Louis. We were staying overnight. The players, we had just played a good game against the Blues, and the players were going out. And I remember being in the lobby, sitting down and seeing Kevin Stevens go to leave with the rest of the guys and thinking to myself, I wonder if he should be doing that. But it went in and out of my brain in a split second. Okay, so fast forward now, I go to bed, go to sleep, get up the next morning. I go in next door to get a coffee, and I get a phone call from the St. Louis security person, because every NHL team has its own security person who looks after stuff that could happen if something with the team there. And he said, Neil, Kevin Stevens is in jail in East St. Louis with a cocaine manufacturing charge and I forget what they do when you're the John, what they call that, but a prostitution. Solicit, yeah. So, yes, that's what it was. And I didn't know what to do. Like, I was just like, oh my God. And right away, it was like, that's Kevin. It wasn't, that's the hockey player. That's the guy. We got to take him with us for the next game. And what the F is he doing? Which is, unfortunately some people's attitude. That wasn't my attitude. My attitude was I was almost in tears. So I stayed behind. The team was leaving that morning because that's what we did. You get up, get on the bus. My coach at that time, John Muckler, had no empathy whatsoever. And I said, well, I'm staying behind. So I'm not going. I'm going to go see him. So I went over to East St. Louis and saw him. And when I saw him, I was just, I was stunned because of the way he looked and the way he, you know, the, it, you know, it would be like seeing me right now. And then 4 hours from now, Craig, you see me and I'm just a mess and I'm drooling and I've got dirty fingernails and my clothes are dirty and I'm disheveled and I don't think broke into tears in front of him because I tried not to do that, but I do know I was a mess. I was crying uh, because I felt so bad for him. And I actually called his wife and said, "You're going to hear about this, but I want to assure you the prostitution thing is not true. He was not with a girl. He was not trying to have sex. He was not, this is a drug issue. And I just want you to know that's the issue." Unfortunately, their marriage didn't last until today. They're not together anymore. But I remember thinking to myself, do whatever you can do to help Kevin's family and help Kevin not lose his family. Even if that took making it up, just do what you got to do to help the human being. And the hockey team, the hockey keep going. Right? Just help this guy.
I think it's got to be pretty rare in your business that someone would see that so selflessly. I mean, they would immediately be drawn to, damn, I'm paying this guy all this money. I stuck my neck out for him, and look what he's betrayed me. And thank you for sharing that story. I was getting ready, kind of finishing up to get ready for the podcast. I took a little break this morning and I read Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's Substack. I don't know if you get that, but he's got a great 2 times a week deal. And he had a quote from Albert Camus: "But hell can endure for only a limited period, and life will begin again one day." And you and I talked about this before the show, the passing of your dear son, Victor, who was your best friend. And I literally was talking to the Stars usher of the seats, and we're just chatting because I'm up at the top in between periods, and he says, "Oh, I'm a New York Rangers fan." Oh, I said, "I'm going to meet Neil Smith tomorrow." He said, "Oh my God, I'd let you know. What a great thing to meet you." You have touched, I'm sure, so many countless people by what you've done in hockey and other things. But I dare say that you've touched more with how you've handled and been so transparent and vulnerable in sharing the circumstances of Victor's passing and how, as a parent, you deal with that. So, would you tell the folks listening a little bit about that story, and then I'll ask you a couple quick questions about lessons that people can take from it.
Yeah, I mean, the story is that there was not a he was not a troubled boy. He was a great kid. Never had a problem with him, and his mother and I were divorced. His mother moved all over the place, and he lived with me. And when this happened, he was 21 years old, going to University of South Carolina, living here in this house that I'm in right now. And what I didn't know and found out when the toxicology came out was that he had made bad decisions in the days leading up to the suicide. And he knew how anti-drug I was and am, especially anti-drug for him, of course. And he knew a kid who gave him some cocaine on a Thursday night, I believe it was, and did some of that. And then I found out through the toxicology that he had meth in his system. Now, meth was actually what we know as ecstasy or Molly. I didn't know that ecstasy was meth. Not that I've taken it or need to know that it's meth, but it is meth. And of course, the thing I did know before this and know even stronger now is that when you do drugs, it's not the drugs that gets you high. It's what the drugs do to your brain and how your brain reacts to them that gets you high. So you snort cocaine, it goes to your pleasure center and allows you to excrete more dopamine. The dopamine gives you a pleasure high, and as you use up that quantity of dopamine that your brain can produce, you have to go back and do more and more hits of cocaine. And the next day after you've done ecstasy or cocaine, and you crash because you don't have the dopamine in your brain. And if you pair that with Saturday night, I came home and I had a friend staying here, and I said, "Where's Victor?" "Oh, he's downstairs watching a movie." I said, "Okay." Victor came up. He was smashed, drinking. And I said, "What the F are you doing?" And I talked to him like a man, like you and I would talk. And I said, "You don't drink alone." He said, "That's not what we do. Like, what's wrong with you? You don't, if you want to try to get girls by drinking, or you want to go out with your buddies and drink, I get it, but alone, like, that's not what we do." And, "Oh, Dad, I'm a college kid, this and that and something else." So he wanted to go out. I wouldn't let him leave. Then the next thing I knew was that he was going up to his room. So he went up to his room. It's 9 o'clock, 9:05, something like that. The shower goes on because I could hear the shower above my kitchen. I have a big house, but every bedroom has its own bathroom and shower. And so I heard the shower go on. So I text him upstairs and said, like, "What are you doing?" He goes, "I'm going to take a shower. I feel dirty." I'm like, "That's weird. Like, he never takes a shower at 9 o'clock at night." Oh, you know your kids' habits, right? I mean, there's one thing you know your kids. So suddenly after that, I get this crazy text from him that's like a last will and testament type thing. Like, "I leave my Stanley Cup rings to my nephews." Well, he doesn't have Stanley Cup rings. I do. I do, that he would have inherited. And he doesn't have nephews. So I threw the phone to my friend and I ran upstairs. I literally ran upstairs and said, "Well, what should I do? What should I do? Read that." And I said, and then I start pounding on his door and yelling his name, because I'm going like, what is he doing? Like, what is going on? And and my friend said, "Break down the door." Of course, I wasn't strong enough, for my house is well made, that I couldn't do that. So I ended up grabbing the pin that's above the door frame and unlocked that door. And I was still screaming his name. And then I had to get into the bathroom, which was also locked. So I quickly was able to get through the second door. And when I opened the shower door, uh, I don't want to be too graphic for your listeners, but there was blood all over the place, and there was my son sitting in the bathtub, convulsing and blood going all over. And my first instinct as a father was to get it out of his eyes and to get it away from his ears. Not knowing, of course, what I know now, which was it was all too late anyway. And I was, hitting him on the back, hitting him on the front, trying to, screaming for my friend to call 911. Um, not, the EMTs come and the insanity sets in for me. Then my brain starts to melt, and all kinds of police show up because there's been a gunshot, and that's the end of your life as you knew it. In one split second, your life as you knew it will never be the same. And that's, and then the real journey begins for the person who is the loved one, who's still left here. And the journey is to do as well as you can through whatever time you have left. Do as well as you can, but you're never getting them back. And I've used the analogy before that it's like somebody cuts off your right arm, and you can either roll over and die, or you can go get a prosthesis, put it on, you learn how to use it, do the best you can, but you're never getting your right arm back. And that's the path I chose. So it's a dark It starts off as a very dark tunnel. You can't see anything. You're in complete blackness, and all you can do is put one foot heel to toe in front of you, hoping that eventually you're going to see some light at the end of the tunnel. Um, and you start to on to the journey like that. And eventually you do see light at the end of the tunnel and you survive. And but life is never the same and it never goes away.
I'm Jewish. I'm not a super religious guy, but I was raised Jewish, and I never totally understood what Jews say when somebody passes away. They say, "May his or her memory be for a blessing." And to me, listening to that beautiful story, obviously Victor's legacy in part is how many people that you and your wife have helped. Victor's stepmom um, kind of ask the right questions as parents, and survive what seems unsurvivable, right? The prosthesis metaphor that you just used. And can you talk a little bit about um, the journey to go from your brain is melted to being somebody who can speak to parents and kids today about suicide?
Well, the first thing that everybody should know is that it's on the menu for this generation. It was never on the menu when I was younger or older, but it is now. And it is definitely on the menu. And of all the kids that I've talked to in this 6 years, when you tell them, they don't have the reaction that an adult has. They don't say, "Oh my God." They say, "Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, I had a friend that did that. I have a." They take it in stride as part of life now. That this is going. Some people are going to pick this. That's the first thing you need to know. It's out there, and I've said to other parents, I said, "Look, you don't want to talk to your kid about pregnancy. You don't want to talk to your kid about STDs. You don't want to talk to your kid about drinking and driving. You don't want to talk to your kid about drugs, but you have to because you're a parent. You gave birth to this person and you got to do the hard stuff. And the hard stuff is sitting down with your daughter or your son, especially if you're a man talking to a daughter, it's going to be harder because it's very distasteful stuff you're going to talk about. And if you're a man, it's talking to your son is not going to be easy because he's going to say, well, of course not, or he's going to, say things like that. But you have to ask these tough questions. You have to ask the hard questions. You have to keep checking in with them. Not saying, are you okay mentally or any silly thing like that, but just keep checking in to make sure that there's no signs. And then for parents of younger children, and I say this as adamantly as I can, do not give them one of these. If you want them to have an emergency device, give them a phone that doesn't let them get to the internet. Do not, and until a certain age, and I'm not a clinician, so I can't tell you what age that is, don't give them access to the internet. And, again, I've said things, I say things flat out now. I don't beat around the bush, but you give that to a 12-year-old with internet access, they can go to Pornhub. Okay. Like, just think about that for a minute. I mean, that is just insane okay. So, and I guess that's my worst example of where they could go. And I'm sure there's maybe even worse examples that I don't know about, but it's this generation of comparing themselves to what else is out there because there's access to so many examples of how your life could be better. And it's all fake, of course. You know, I tried to tell someone that using a hockey analogy that when you see a picture of a hockey player with his stick up in the air and his other arm up in the air, and you assume that, boy, they must have played well last night. They must have won the game. But then when you read under the photo that that was the one goal they got in a 10-1 shellacking that they took, you realize that, wow, I guess it wasn't all that great. The picture made it look great, and that split second made it look great, but when I read what it really wasn't that great. And the same thing goes on with these kids. So they're looking and saying, I'm a loser. This guy's got a BMW. That guy's got this. This guy's got that. That guy's got that. He's going to Yale. I got to go to Western Michigan. Whatever. And these comparables are all BS, and they shouldn't be comparing themselves. What they should be the best version they can be of themselves. And that's it, not of other people and of other women. Let's say for a young girl, just be the best version you can be of yourself. And it's really hard if you're giving them that thing that is an addictive device, because I know my son was addicted to it. I can tell you that for sure. He was addicted to that thing. You could shave his head bald. He'd be okay, but don't take away his phone. That's, how it was. So that's the kind of advice I try to give parents. And I also am open about what I've been through. And because if men don't want to be vulnerable, and this is what you find by going to group therapy. The husband and wife show up for a meeting about suicide where they've lost a child. The husband never shows up again, and the wife comes to every session. Because women don't mind being vulnerable. They'll sit and they'll cry to each other and they'll talk. Well, again, men don't want to be, they think we're taught that you're weak if you're vulnerable. Don't tell people where your weaknesses are. Don't say, poor me or anything like that. Well, how are you going to help anybody if you never tell anybody what you've been through? How are you ever going? And the thing is that when you tell people and you're vulnerable and you say, you know what, Craig, here's my story. And suddenly Craig says back to you, oh, my wife's, brother did that. I know all about it, and described the pain to me. Well, how am I ever going to find out who's in this horrible club with me if I never tell anybody I'm in it? And so, we have done, and I got to tell you another example. Luke Richardson is the head coach of Chicago, had a good career as a player. I remember years ago reading that Luke Richardson had lost a daughter through suicide. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, the poor family, the poor parents, it must have been in therapy. That I wonder if it was a drug thing. I wonder if there was a lot of psychology, and I wonder. When I talked to Luke Richardson after this happened to me, I said, Luke, what happened with your daughter? And he said, oh, she was on the hockey team. It was in Ottawa. She was on the hockey team. She had just gotten a great report card. Everything was really good. We thought everything was fine. My wife came home and found her hanging in the basement. And that's as stunning as it is. And I say it like that in order to stun people, because it is stunning to me, as I described when I went upstairs to Luke Richardson's wife. And here's me who's been through things. I'm going to say what everybody else says. I can't imagine coming home to that. So, it's, it's very hard. It's a very hard thing, but you've got to be vulnerable, and you have to be willing to help. I would have, if 10 years ago, 20 years ago, somebody had lost a child, as my neighbor did a few doors from me in a tragic accident, his 16-year-old daughter, I would have backed away and thought, oh, well, they probably don't want me to call them. They're going through a tough time. I better leave them alone. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I'm not going to bother them. All you're really doing is chickening out. To be honest with you, that's all you're really doing. You're making excuses of why you're not going to do it, because you really don't want to do it, because it's painful to do that. And So after this, I call people, I'll say to people that I'll meet at the hockey games, they'll tell me about what happened to one of their friends. And I say, give them my phone number and tell them to call me if they want to talk because of what I've been through. So I learned, Craig, to do what firemen, and that is when everybody's running out of the building, they're running in. And when everybody's running away from somebody who's going through this horrible time, I'm running in. I'm calling them and saying, I haven't got any words. I'm just telling you I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. So when the time is right, we'll talk. And I said, but I'm here for you, and I'm not going to go anywhere.
I mean, that is so incredibly beautiful. I don't even know what to say. I think the thing that you do for people that you have the power to do uniquely is you do have the capacity to put this beautiful shine on your life and create this perfectly curated image of who you are. And you've earned that right. You've accomplished so much. And what you're doing instead is you are keeping life real for all of us who have issues, family members with mental illness, and have tragedies in their lives and need an example of how to create comfort and safety around that circumstance. So I've heard you talk about Victor in other realms, but never so beautifully. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. And I know people listening are going to come away with a new tool in their toolkit to be better parents, to be better friends, to be better spouses.